Yes, The Amazing Spider-Man is a reboot for a new Spider-Man series. I think we should all get over that. I'm being honest. The Amazing Spider-Man. So The Amazing Spider-Man is the story about Spider-Man. You know, Peter Parker, he was a nerdy kid in school, and then he got bitten by a radioactive spider, and then he becomes the superhero Spider-Man. And I've heard such mixed reviews about this movie. Some people love it, some people hate it, some people say it's just ripping off the Sam Raimi movies, which, to be honest, it's a pretty stupid argument. I think that's a stupid argument. It's a Spider-Man movie. Peter Parker's gonna be a nerdy kid in high school who gets picked on, who gets bitten by a spider, who gets spider-like powers, and then something tragic happens in his life, and then he becomes the superhero Spider-Man. That's just called being accurate, not ripping off a movie that came decades after the source material. The question is, does this movie do Spider-Man well? Does it do it justice? And I personally believe, yeah, I thought it kicked ass. I mean, more than kicked ass, although the action's really cool and I liked him web slinging, but you've seen web slinging before. It is not 10 years ago where Spider-Man cinematography is just gonna blow you away because you're like, wow, it's almost like this hasn't ever happened before. We've seen most things that special effects can do, so you can't rely on special effects to bring wow to the movie. If wow is a term, that sounded really pretentious. What you should rely on is the characters being relatable and having layers to them. And that's where I think this movie really excelled. I loved Peter Parker's character. He was a really relatable character. And the thing is, alright, Peter Parker is always a nerd in high school. That's the story of Peter Parker. But what's nerdy now was not nerdy 10 years ago, and that was not nerdy decades before when Spider-Man was created. What is nerdy or cool and not cool, that changes over time. So they made a Peter Parker that I think will actually last through the decades. He's kind of the quiet kid who sits in the back of class, kind of keeps to himself, and he's really good at science. I'm pretty sure if he didn't become Spider-Man, he'd become a serial killer. But I think this movie did the character of Peter Parker justice. And I thought he and Gwen Stacy were really good together. They were really cute. They were a cute couple. You buy the fact that at first he has a crush on her, but she's nerdy enough to, you know, be interested in him too. And then he gets his confidence up because, you know, he can break people in half. I mean, he doesn't, but he could if you wanted to. That'll give you a boost of confidence. That's just realistic. And so I bought that in this movie. Now, one of the myths about this movie is that it's copying The Dark Knight because it's darker. I personally don't feel it's doing that in my humble opinion. What I do feel it's doing is taking the Peter Parker Spider-Man story and making it more realistic. I mean, you know, the Sam Raimi movies, as much as I enjoyed them, well, the first two, they were a bit cheesy. I'm just saying, you know, and it plays raindrops keep falling on my head in Spider-Man 2, then it all freezes like a Mentos commercial. It made me laugh, but it was cheesy. This Amazing Spider-Man movie is simply taking the cheese out of it. It still does have humor in it, but the humor works. It never crosses that line into cheesy, I didn't think. And if they are making it more realistic, here's the realistic truth about life itself. It's a little dark sometimes. Sorry, I didn't want to be the one to tell you, but sometimes life itself is a bit dark. And the movie doesn't go overboard in darkness. I'm just saying that it does have dark tones in it sometimes. I mean, something really tragic in Peter Parker's life happens that makes him Spider-Man. That event was a lot more tragic in this movie. I mean, you really felt it. You're like, that really sucks. And he deals with it for quite some time. He has a chip on his shoulder. He's not really that responsible with it at first. His superpowers, that is. He is a bit of a vigilante. The whole, like, power and responsibility thing hasn't quite sunk in because, you know, that's just how a teenager would deal with the situation. A teenager's not going to be like, Uncle Ben said be responsible, so that's what I'm going to do. There's going to be some conflict within him, and there's going to be some gray areas that he meddles in. And that's what I really liked about how they use Spider-Man's humor. I mean, Spider-Man, if you don't know, he's actually a pretty humorous dude. And you know that scene in the trailer where he's taking down that one guy, he's like, oh, you found my weakness, it's small knives. The movie illustrates that Spider-Man's humor really is a tactic that he uses. That's what he does. There's this one scene where he gets his powers, and before he's Spider-Man, he humiliates someone, and even Uncle Ben's like, that's not how you do it. And I loved how even after, you know, Spider-Man's whole tragedy thing, you know, where he's supposed to be responsible and whatnot, he still humiliates the bad guys. Because as much as you want Spider-Man to be this super person who's like, no, I follow Uncle Ben's teachings to a T, in the end, he is his own guy and he's gonna do what he does. I like that. It made Spider-Man such a real character for me. One thing that I felt was really wasted in the movie was the villain, the Lizard. The Lizard, if you don't know, is a scientist named Dr. Kirk Connors, and he doesn't have an arm, and so he's splicing animal DNA with human DNA, and he does it with a lizard, and he helps him grow his arm back, but now he becomes this big mutant lizard that's terrorizing everyone. They wasted the character because they had such an opportunity to be like, alright, the Lizard is the bad guy, but Dr. Connors is not. So no matter what we do, we need to find out how to take out the Lizard, but not Dr. Connors, because he's a good guy. This Lizard's just a maniac. But they didn't really illustrate that fact. I felt like when he was the Lizard, if he just dropped off a building and splatted on the pavement and died, I'd be like, oh sweet, well at least that bad guy's taken out. Chalk one up for the good guys. I shouldn't feel like that that with the Lizard. There should be some humanity that you want to preserve. I mean, maybe they could have showed Dr. Connors with his wife and kid, you know, add some humanity to the character. In the end, he's a guy in a lab coat where you're like, all right, you're going to turn into a bad guy, and then we're going to need to take you out because that's what good guys do. There are a couple of moments in this movie too where you're like, you probably shouldn't have done that in front of people. Yeah, they all know you're Spider-Man now because you just did that thing that really gives you away, but no one really questions it. They're like, oh, he just threw that football and bent that pole. No human being could do that. Maybe Spider-Man could, but he's not Spider-Man. We're not even going to question it. I found that a little weird, a little easy. The Amazing Spider-Man had great characters, really exciting moments. They developed the characters well. You deal with the tragedy with Peter Parker, minus the fact that they kind of wasted their opportunity with the Lizard, and I didn't find the Lizard too compelling. I'm going to say I will buy The Amazing Spider-Man on Blu-ray. Which I will say this, if they didn't squander the Lizard and they made him more of a relevant villain, and not just a hollow CGI thing that Spider-Man needs to fight, this movie probably would have pulled an awesome-tacular from me. Alright, so your favorite Spider-Man villain, who is he or she? Whoever they are, comment below, let me know. And as always, if you like what you've seen here and you want to see more, click right here to see more.